My guest is Dr. Chad Hanson, who is a research ecologist and the director of the John Muir Project of Earth Island Institute, located in Big Bear City, California. Dr. Hanson has a PhD in ecology from the University of California at Davis, with a research focus on fire ecology. He is author of the 2021 book Smokescreen: Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate. Chad, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
Tell us about Smokescreen. What motivated you to write this book, and what are some of the big ideas in it?
Yeah, I was a co-editor and co-author of a forest and fire ecology science textbook in 2015, along with my friend and colleague, Dr. Dominic De La Sala. And we covered a lot of these key issues and really brought things up to speed on the science, where things are relative to past assumptions. But we did it from a technical standpoint, and it wasn't accessible to the general public necessarily as just a sort of a technical science textbook. And so it became clear to me through conversations with various people that there was a need for a version of the textbook that was written for lay people, for non-scientists, and that wove in personal experiences and anecdotes to illustrate key scientific points. And so that's why I wrote Smokescreen, and that was the spirit of it. It was to convey the science and to have all the scientific citations, but in endnotes at the end, if people wanted to dig up those studies, but to convey it in a more of a narrative framework, so that people could understand it, and so it might be more engaging than just the the dry technical information.
Sure. What would you like for people to know about climate change as it relates to forest preservation?
That is a key central question. So the main issue, and this is something I address right off the bat in Smokescreen. I mean, I talk about this in the very first chapter. There's a misconception among the general public, among a lot of environmental reporters, among a lot of policymakers, people in many cases who should know better. They have a misconception that we can solve the climate crisis if we just get away from fossil fuels. If we transition, relatively quickly to clean energy, that everything will be fine. And that is absolutely categorically not true. That's not even a matter of debate in scientific circles. And that time passed around the early 1990s, right around 1990. That whole conversation became obsolete. Parts per million CO2 equivalents are way too high. Carbon in our atmosphere is just way, way too high, greenhouse gases. And the problem is, once you put up those excess greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, they stay up there for a very, very long time. We call that CO2 residence time. And so it's going to stay there at catastrophic levels that will wreak havoc on our climate for literally centuries or longer if that excess carbon doesn't get drawn down and reduced. Well, the only effective way to do that at scale, and the only environmentally positive way to do that, is by protecting ecosystems, especially forests, so that they can absorb more CO2. For the simple reason that trees essentially breathe in CO2 the way that humans breathe in oxygen, and they use the carbon to grow and build wood, and they breathe out oxygen in the same way that we breathe out CO2. And so forests are by far our best solution to draw down the excess atmospheric CO2. Oceans are doing what they can, but they're already getting saturated, and there's all kinds of serious implications and impacts from that. But our forests can absorb and store vastly more CO2. The main reason they're not absorbing even more than they're already doing is because we keep pulling massive amounts of carbon out of our forests through logging operations. And these days, most of that happens under deceptive euphemisms like forest health and restoration and thinning and fuel reduction. And a lot of this whole parade of deceptive euphemisms that's just masking the same old logging that was done in the 1970s and 1980s. And the difference being that now it's having not just serious biodiversity consequences, it's having catastrophic climate change consequences.
So, talk about fuel reduction and thinning. What is going on there? And what would you like for people to know about that?
Yeah. So terms like fuel reduction and thinning, they're political terms. These are not scientific terms. They're used by agencies and some agency scientists, but they're fundamentally political terms that are used to promote an economic agenda, a logging agenda. When people hear the term thinning, the imagery that they conjure in their mind is of Forest Service employees out there in their, smoky bear green outfits with pruning shears, cutting some seedlings and maybe a few saplings, maybe the odd shrub, trimming some lower limbs. That's what people think of. The vast majority. I've had countless conversations, more than I could ever recount, with people of various types in political circles and general public media, and that's really what they think. And the Forest Service fosters deliberately that impression by saying things like, "Oh well, we need to thin small trees and underbrush, thin small trees and underbrush." What they don't tell the public is that what they're removing, because they do remove small trees too, but mostly what they're removing is large old trees, mature and old growth trees. That is the overwhelming majority of the actual mass of wood, biomass, carbon that's being pulled out of our forests in these so-called thinning projects. These are actually just commercial logging projects masquerading as something else. And so what people don't realize in many cases that the U.S. Forest Service is in the commercial logging business. It under the current laws, it sells public trees to private logging companies and keeps the revenue for its budget. It is literally in the commercial logging business, and so that is something that Congress has to change. These are laws that go back to 1897. They have no place in a 21st century world where we need our forests to absorb and store more carbon. But there you have it. Those are the laws that exist, and the logging industry spreads around a lot of money to both political parties in the form of campaign contributions to keep that system going. And so the public really does need to put pressure on both Democrats and Republicans to change that. In the meantime, that's what's happening. And the most important thing people can do is just understand that they're being deceived when they hear terms like thinning. And that these are actually logging projects that are killing far more trees than they prevent from being killed. They're logging projects that are tripling carbon emissions into the atmosphere relative to fire alone on a per acre basis. Logging projects that are actually not stopping wildfires. They actually change the microclimate of the forest in a way that reduces shade, reduces the moisture in the system because the shade is reduced, reduces the windbreak effect that a denser forest has, and actually makes the wildfires spread faster and oftentimes more intensely, frequently toward towns, which creates an increased community safety problem. And so these logging projects are not solving anything. They're just exacerbating the climate crisis, the extinction crisis, and the threats to our communities. And so we need to change direction, and we need to start focusing our resources on protecting communities directly from fire. And there's smart, highly effective ways to do that, like home hardening and defensible space pruning in the immediate vicinity of homes within 60 feet generally. But not backcountry logging under deceptive euphemisms like thinning and fuel reduction.
So, what is home hardening, and is the other term defensive spacing? How do those things work? And what we're talking about here is how to protect homes from
Right.
forest fires.
Yeah. So home hardening is basically, just key practical steps that can protect a home from burning, and they're highly effective. I'll just list a few of the top ones. Um, Roofing is key. Most modern roofs are very effective. They're fine. They're either composition roof, which is not combustible, or it's a metal roof, which is even better, but they're both good. Very few people have a wood roof anymore, but if anyone does and they live near wildlands, they should replace that with a composition roof or a metal roof. But in most cases, it's much simpler and much less expensive than that. The main reason homes burn in wildfires is from embers. just little flaming particles, little pieces of wood, little flaming leaves that are driven by the winds in advance of the flames. And these embers can be driven by the winds half a mile, 2 miles, or more in advance of where the fire actually is. Most of the homes that burn in wildfires never come in contact with the flames. They are already in smoldering ruins by the time the fire reaches the town, because the homes are not defended. They have not done the home hardening, and the embers land by the thousands on the homes. They land on a roof, and there's 4 inches of dry pine needles and leaves on the roof that the homeowner hasn't swept off the roof, or they land on a roof and roll down into a rain gutter that doesn't have a rain gutter guard, and there's dry leaves and pine needles in the rain gutter, and it causes an ignition, gets the roof on fire. Or even more commonly, there's old, a lot of the houses have those coarse wire mesh vents in the attic spaces from the 1970s or 1980s. The embers just float right through that, and they cause an ignition inside the attic. You can spend $200 or $300 at a hardware store, Home Depot or Lowe's typically, and you can buy modern ember-proof vents. And it's very easy to install, very inexpensive, and they will not allow any embers to come in. Spend a little bit of time in the late spring sweeping all those dry pine needles and leaves off the roof, and putting on some rain gutter guards. And those steps alone will save the great majority of homes from burning in a fire. The second thing is what we call defensible space. And it's really just pruning of vegetation within 60 feet of the home, especially the first 10 or 20 feet. That's the most important. And this is not about cutting down mature trees or anything like that. You actually want those trees for shade. But it's about removing lower limbs. It's about removing dry grasses and accumulations of twigs and dry leaves right next to the home. Beyond about 60 or at most 100 feet from homes, no additional vegetation management or removal provides any additional benefit to home protection. It's really about the home itself and the immediate vicinity. And so the vast majority of our money right now for, under the rubric of wildfire management is going to backcountry logging projects that are promising to communities to act as fuel breaks, fire breaks, and stop the fires from reaching towns. The problem is that not only is that damaging a lot of sensitive wildlife habitat, and not only is it making climate change worse by increasing carbon emissions, because every tree that's removed from the forest, most of that carbon goes into the atmosphere almost immediately. Very little ends up in a lumber product somewhere. Right. But in addition, it's giving communities a false sense of security, because they think that logging project, they've been told by agencies that they trust, that logging project will stop a fire from reaching the town. And so they're not doing the defensible space work. They're not doing the home hardening, because they think, well, I have a tight budget. Why should I spend a few $100s on that when the Forest Service has told me that this logging project that they're calling a thinning project out there in the backcountry over that ridge a mile or two away, that's somehow going to stop the fire and save the town. And in addition, it's diverting resources away from what could be used for home hardening and defensible space, and subsidizing these backcountry logging projects on public lands. And so what's actually happening is these fires are driven mostly by weather and climate factors and climate change. They're not driven by the density of the forest. In fact, they're actually mitigated by the density of the forest. And when these thinning projects happen, the fires are blowing right through them, and they're burning down thousands of homes and oftentimes killing dozens of people. And we've seen it in fire after fire. We saw it in the Camp Fire of 2018 in the town of Paradise. We saw it in the Dixie Fire of 2021 in the town of Greenville, Caldor Fire of 2021 in the town of Grizzly Flats, and countless others, where these fires have just blown through thousands of acres that were, so-called thinned in the name of creating fire breaks, and it just burned even more rapidly through those thinned areas and burned the town down. So we need to recognize the science and change direction, but we also need to recognize that there's a lot of money involved doing things the way that we're doing them right now. A lot of people are getting rich with the status quo. Members of Congress are getting campaign contributions, both sides of the aisle politically. The Forest Service is making a bunch of money tens of millions of dollars every year on timber sale receipts. They're making even more money in congressional appropriations taken right out of taxpayer pockets to subsidize this logging. The logging industry, of course, is making bank, and taxpayers are footing the bill, and we're suffering the consequences. So, we need to hold our elected officials accountable to the current science, and recognize that people are making money and are incentivized to do the wrong things right now because it's profitable to them.
One of the things that you've said, and you just alluded to it a minute ago, is that the U.S. Forest Service is in the commercial logging business. How does that work?
Well, when the national forests were first established, it goes back to 1891, March of 1891. Congress passed legislation that said that the presidents could establish national forests out of the kind of what were just unreserved federal lands at the time. And they could establish national forests through presidential proclamations. And the presidents did that in successive stages through the early and mid 1890s. And that's how the initial national forest system really was established. More came after, but a lot of them were established early on like that. Well, the government created regulations to implement that, and those regulations were finalized in 1894, and they were really very clear and strict, very protective. There was no logging, no mining. There were national forests were really treated as protected areas. And the logging industry didn't like that. And so they lobbied members of Congress. They spread a lot of money around. And in 1897, under pressure from the logging industry, Congress attached an appropriations rider that allowed logging for the first time to occur on national forests. It was June 4th, 1897, that appropriations rider passed. The first timber sale was implemented on a national forest in 1899. I think that was in the Black Hills National Forest in South Dakota. And then it just snowballed from there, and more laws were passed by Congress to encourage more logging. And so what might have made sense in 1897 or 1920 or 1950 in terms of how we prioritize things, how we understand the natural world and our relationship to it, what makes sense as an economic model, big Western and Eastern logging companies, as opposed to the recreation economy, for example, that is much, much larger and much more lucrative for rural towns. Plundering our national forests for the benefit of logging companies coast to coast, as opposed to protecting our national forests as carbon sinks and as biodiversity reserves and as areas for Americans from all walks of life to recreate. Those choices weren't being made back in 1897. This was the Congress thought of most of these areas as the frontier, to be exploited and tamed, and that was the ideology back then. And there's all kinds of problems with that ideology, but the issue is that the management of our national forests, the legal structure, has not fundamentally changed since 1897. It's been modified slightly many times in subtle ways, but fundamentally, the initial goal, initial management of the national forests, which was upended in 1897, needs to be reversed and returned to its initial purpose, because that's what the 21st century calls for.
What would you like to see happen in terms of public policy?
Well, Congress needs to pass a law to get the U.S. Forest Service and the other federal land management agencies, the Bureau of Land Management and the National Park Service. It needs to pass a law to get them out of the commercial logging business, and no more of this nonsense with the euphemisms where they can do commercial logging and pretend like it's not by saying it's thinning or fuel reduction or restoration. Logging is logging. If they're removing trees and selling them to logging companies, guess what? That's logging. And we just need federal legislation to prohibit that and make that an illegal activity on our federal public lands. Straight up.
So your focus is fire ecology. I think I understood you to say that you've been a field ecologist with a focus on fire ecology for the last 20 years or more.
Yep.
And so what would you like for people to know about, when a forest burns naturally and then it regenerates after that? What would you like for people to know about that regeneration process? And also, why do we not want to go in and log that land after it's burned?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess, from the 30,000 foot level, the key thing for people to understand is that we need to have completely separate conversations about fire in our forests versus fire in communities. A fire is catastrophic if it destroys a town, if it burns homes, if someone is hurt or killed in a fire, in a wildfire. That's always a tragedy. It's always a catastrophe. A fire out in the forest wildlands is not a catastrophe. It's actually a restorative, a rejuvenating event. A fire doesn't destroy or remove habitat. It creates wildlife habitat. Areas that burn in forests, if they are not subjected to post-fire logging, which destroys forests and removes the habitat that fire creates, but if forests are just left to natural rejuvenation, natural regeneration after fires, the habitat that's created by fire, including and especially the places that burn the hottest and kill most or all the trees, interestingly and somewhat counterintuitively, those are actually some of the most biodiverse areas in all of our forest ecosystems in North America. Those are ecological treasures. They're not ecological, losses or evidence of damage. In fact, there are countless plant and animal species that have evolved over millions of years, in some cases tens of millions, to not only depend on the habitat created by fire in general, but many of them have evolved to depend specifically on the unique habitat created where in those minority of places, that 20 or 25% typically in a given fire, that burns hot, where the fire does kill most or all the trees, that in years past, decades past, people assumed were destroyed by fire. In fact, there are so many plants and animals that depend on those areas where fire burns hot. And there's a lot of wildlife species that depend on stands of recently fire-killed trees. They depend on dead trees, not live trees. A lot of species need live trees, but a lot of species need dead trees more than anything. And so,
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
So, speaking of dead trees, it's interesting to me how the role of dead matter, the dead wood, and organic matter in a forest is interesting. I think you'll agree that it's a mistake to think that if something is dead, it needs to be removed. In fact, if it's dead, a lot of times it does more good when it's dead than when it was alive. So how does that work?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll just kind of talk through one of the ecological relationships, and there are many, many, many of these. But you're absolutely right. A dead tree of a given size is actually far more valuable to biodiversity, to wildlife, than a live tree of the same size, ton for ton. Live trees are very important too. And you want that mix because there's a lot of species that depend on stands of mostly live trees. But there is nothing more ecologically valuable, ton for ton, than a dead tree or a down log when that tree falls. So here's how it works. You have a fire that comes through. Well, summer conditions, hot, dry, windy day, you get a dry lightning strike maybe, and you get a wildfire that's taking off and it's burning through the forest. These fires, no matter how big they are, they're mostly low and moderate intensity. They creep along the forest floor. They don't kill many trees. They'll scorch them, but they won't kill the trees except for the smallest ones. But there are places where typically the wind flares up and it's a particularly hot, dry, windy condition, and the flames will rise higher and they will kill most or all the trees, oftentimes 20 or 25% of a given fire. That's natural. It's been going on for tens of millions of years. When that happens, it creates a unique forest habitat type that we call snag forest habitat. More technically, it's known as complex early seral forest, but that's such a mouthful. I don't use that term very often. what happens is when that patch of snag forest habitat is created by that hotter patch of fire, and that kills most or all the trees in that patch, it generates a certain amount of heat and also smoke. The fire alone will generate a certain amount of smoke, but of course, there's more intense activity in that particular spot. There are dozens of native species of beetles that have evolved over millions of years to depend on recently fire-killed trees in order to reproduce. These are called wood-boring beetles, and they've evolved receptors in their bodies to detect fire by heat or smoke from miles away. And these beetles are very large, and they're pretty good flyers. They will fly from miles away right toward the fire. And they will arrive right after the flames have passed and the smoke is still hanging in the air. As soon as the fire-killed trees have cooled enough, they land on the charred bark of those fire-killed trees. They lay their eggs. Their larvae develop and bore through the charred bark into the wood of the tree. And that's where they develop over time into adults. And this happens in the tens of thousands, could be the millions. While the beetle larvae are in these fire-killed trees, these snags, standing dead trees, that's the primary food source for many, many different species of woodpeckers that have in turn evolved to depend on the larvae of these beetles for their food source. That's what they depend on. They can't survive without that. And so they'll eat these beetles by the thousands every year. One of the species I've been studying for about 20 years now is the blackback woodpecker, actually over 20 years. And the blackback woodpecker has evolved that dependency on these beetle larvae. They actually have also evolved a jet black back so that they're completely camouflaged against the charred bark of a fire-killed tree. This is their home. This is what they need. And they're just one of many species, but just one example. One blackback woodpecker will eat about 13,500 of these beetle larvae every single year. Just one. And even more, of course, to feed its young. And so you need a lot of fire-killed trees. Typically, you need for one pair of blackback woodpeckers and their young. They're monogamous species, and they make a new nest cavity every year. They need 200-300 acres, sometimes more, of this habitat to make a living. And the interesting thing is that fire-killed dead trees, including fire-killed trees, they're softer than live trees. For the simple reason that after they die, they start to decay a little bit. Decay makes them a little softer. And that means that the woodpeckers can excavate nest cavities in the dead trees in ways that they can't do in live trees. So not only are they getting food from the dead trees, but they're also getting homes from the dead trees because they can create those nest cavities. The woodpeckers, they almost never reuse the same nest cavity. And there's all kinds of evolutionary reasons for that. But they almost never reuse. They create new ones every single year. And in fact, they'll create typically 2 or 3 each year, and then they pick the one they like the best. So these woodpeckers are creating new nest cavities all over the place in these fire-killed trees. And so they don't not only have homes for themselves, but they're creating homes for dozens and dozens of other native wildlife species in the forest that have to have tree cavities to raise their young, but are not able to create cavities on their own because they're not woodpeckers. Bluebirds, nuthatches, small mammals like chipmunks, flying squirrels, and the list goes on and on and on. There's many, many dozens of them, bird and small mammal species. And so they depend upon the woodpeckers to create the habitat they need for them to raise their young and reproduce. Without the woodpeckers creating those cavities, there go your bluebirds, there go your nuthatches, there go your flying squirrels and your chipmunks. And now you have no food for a lot of the raptors like goshawks and Cooper's hawks. So you have less food in terms of the small mammals for owls and for bobcats and foxes. And for the woodpeckers to exist, you've got to have the beetle larva. For the beetle larva to exist, you've got to have the fire that kills the trees. And so it's a rich interconnected system. And that's just one string of relationships. There are many others in the forest that are stimulated by these patches of high intensity fire. including the plant life that's stimulated, and the reproduction and germination of plants that's only stimulated by fire that reaches a certain level of intensity. Many of these plants, you will not see them for many human generations until a high intensity fire occurs, and boom, here they are, because their reproduction is tied specifically to fire of a high intensity. And now you've got all these wildflower species and these flowering shrubs that are growing in, and that attracts fly catching. It attracts native flying insects, and that attracts fly catching birds and bats that have food now. And so you have all of this biodiversity, all this rich biodiversity, all this food and habitat that's actually created by fire in these places that people have misunderstood for years, and think that somehow that the fire, because it burned hot in those places, has destroyed the fire. And so it feeds into this very outdated and false good fire, bad fire paradigm, that a good fire is a surface fire that creeps along the forest floor, consumes some dead needles and some dead leaves, and some twigs, and maybe the odd seedling or sapling, but otherwise doesn't really do anything in the forest. And that bad fire are those patches of high intensity fire that kill most or all the trees. And the truth is that they're both natural, but the latter is where you get most of your biodiversity.
Talk about small mammals. It's like, why and how do small mammals have more habitat in a post-fire situation?
Well, for a couple of reasons. And not just post-fire, they have more habitat mostly in the areas that burn hotter, that burn at higher intensity, where most or all the trees are killed. So a few things happen. So when the trees get killed by fire, they start to decay, and the top will break off in a winter wind, and now you have these down logs that you didn't have before. Oftentimes in forests, until you get a higher intensity fire patch, those down logs from the last time that happened, 200 years earlier maybe, have already long since decayed into soil, and so you don't have that habitat. But when a higher intensity fire happens, kills most of the trees, some of those will fall in the following years. Tops will break off. Now you've got nice down logs. It will stimulate the germination of all these native flowering shrubs, and you have this understory vegetation you didn't have before, including wildflowers and flowering shrubs. And the combination of those two things, as well as the standing snags with the woodpecker cavities, it creates optimal habitat for small mammals, because now you have, because of the flowering plants, you have a lot more habitat for insects, flying insects and insects on the ground, and also the down logs. A lot of the insects depend on down logs, and that means more food for the small mammals. A lot of them depend on insects for their primary food. And because you have the down logs, you have great denning habitat for small mammals, because they live in and under down logs. And so the down logs are great habitat, and the snags are great habitat, because some of them climb up the dead trees and they live in the cavities that the woodpeckers created 2 or 3 years earlier. And so there's more homes and there's more food for them. And for that reason, we find that small mammal biomass, total abundance of small mammals, is 2 to 6 times higher in the post-fire habitat areas than it is in an unburned mature forest.
What can you say about the ability of a biologically diverse forest to prevent flooding? It seems to me that a biologically diverse forest is going to absorb more rainfall, and therefore there's going to be less flooding. Is that true?
It does. You plant life and biomass absorbs water. And so it's, of course, natural for a certain amount of water to flow into streams and then into rivers and to flow downhill. But it's also natural for a large portion of that water that comes down in the form of rainfall and snowmelt to be absorbed by plant life. And that means trees. That also means shrubs. It means forbs. It means all the plant life in the forest. And so the more of that you have, and by the way, even like dead plant material, like down logs,
Right. Right.
they absorb enormous amounts of water. They act much more like giant sponges than they do like fuel. Just for an example, one study found that even in a drought year, that the down logs will soak up and absorb and store 25 times more water per cubic foot than the surrounding soil. It's extraordinary. And so plant life, live and dead, trees, shrubs, live trees, standing trees, fallen trees, it all absorbs water and stores it. And so when you remove that plant life through logging operations and you create a more sparsely vegetated environment, there's just simply less to absorb water, and more of that runs down stream and ends up increasing flooding, oftentimes with catastrophic impacts to communities.
Right. So when logging occurs, I would assume that degrades the biology of the forest in multiple ways. What are some of the ways that logging degrades the biology of a forest?
Yeah, good question. So, a fire and other natural disturbance processes that kill trees, but especially fire. Fire creates habitat. It transforms habitat, but it doesn't take away. Logging only takes away. It only removes. And what people, I think, oftentimes fail to understand is that a forest ecosystem is not a collection of live, mature trees. That's one component of about 6 that define a forest ecosystem. It's also the small trees, small live trees. It's the dead trees. It's the down logs. It's the shrubs. It's the wildflowers. There are many, many different things that make up a forest ecosystem, and every single one of those components has different groups of plant and animal species that have evolved to depend on them. And what logging does is it takes away most or all of those habitat elements that literally define a forest ecosystem and upon which biodiversity is predicated. And so, fire is a source of tree mortality. Certainly, a fire will come through, it'll kill a portion of the trees in any given area. In some spots, it might kill most or all the trees. In some spots, it might kill 5% or 10% of the trees. But it's a source of tree mortality. The difference is that the carbon is still there. If fire kills a tree, it only consumes a tiny percentage of the carbon, 2-3% at most. And now you've got a snag that is important. It's stored carbon. It's great wildlife habitat. When it falls, it's just as good a wildlife habitat. Then it decays. It returns nutrients to the soil, helps the forest maintain its productivity, helps trees grow, the next generation of trees, and absorb more carbon from the atmosphere. Whereas logging is also a source of tree mortality. The difference is that after logging, what you have is not a snag or a down log. What you have is a stump, which contributes nothing.
So another thing that logging does is that it removes nutrients from the forest. Is that right? And how does that work? And why should we be concerned about that?
It's a really big deal. The trees, forests are great recyclers. Trees grow, they live, they die, they fall, they decay, and that process of decay and all the different insects that are involved in that process and fungi in that decay process help return all those nutrients to the soil. And it's not just simple things like carbon and nitrogen. It's also calcium, it's potassium, it's magnesium. They all play critical roles. And all those nutrients are stored in the tree. A lot of it's in, some in the wood, some in the bark and the needles and the twigs. When logging occurs, all of those nutrients are removed from the system, or most of them are removed, depending upon the type of logging. But the point is that nutrients and nutrient cycling potential is significantly reduced anytime logging occurs, even if it's just partial cutting, like these so-called thinning projects, where they don't remove every tree, but they remove a lot of them. And what the problem is that that reduces the productivity of the forest. It reduces the potential and the capacity for trees to grow. It reduces potential growth rates. It reduces the capacity of that forest to draw down the excess CO2 in the atmosphere. And the more logging that happens and the more cycles of logging that happens, the worse that gets. And so this whole idea that the logging industry has been pitching to the public and policymakers for decades that logging forests are a renewable resource, trees are a renewable resource. That is an absolute falsehood. That is not accurate at all. Trees are not a renewable resource. Logging is not a renewable activity. Every time trees are removed from a given area, it is a tax on the system, and it reduces the productivity and the capacity, not just reduces the habitat complexity and the biodiversity, but it reduces the capacity of that system to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere and grow and maintain itself. After several cycles, you will see in some areas such sparse conditions that it's hard to even call it a forest anymore. Some areas that I've seen that have been logged 3-4 times over the last 150 years, you really can't even call it a forest anymore. There's so little, the capacity to grow and maintain forest cover has been so severely compromised by the nutrient removal in several cycles over time that it's really just a sparsely vegetated area.
When they remove a tree, do they take the whole tree or most of it? And does that vary depending on whether they're on the forest? And does it vary depending on whether they're looking for wood, for construction, or for biomass, or for paper?
In the past, the logging companies would strip the branches off of the tree, pretty much where it was felled, and they would cut the top part off, and then they would cut the main trunk of the tree into sections, and then load them up into log trucks and haul them away. And then they would either just leave the what we call logging slash debris, the branches and the treetops, on site, or they would bulldoze them into giant piles and put accelerant on them and burn them, which is much more common. When they left them on site, those at least the branches, the tree trunk that they removed and the bark that they removed, that's removing enormous amounts of nutrients from the system. But at least a portion of the nutrients would stay. But of course, they realized that all that logging slash debris was increasing fire intensity when wildfires would happen, and so they started bulldozing them into giant piles, and that would cause enormous amounts of soil damage. It wasn't contributing to nutrient cycling because the piles would just cook and cook and cook in that spot where they bulldoze them, and it would destroy the soil. And so you'd get these big spots, 60-foot diameter spots where there was a 25, 30-foot high pile of slash debris that they bulldozed and then put a bunch of accelerant on it. It would just cook for weeks. And many of those areas, you get these big circles where nothing will grow, where those old logging operations happen. These days, what they do is they tend to remove everything. They'll remove the small trees, they'll remove the big trees, they'll remove the branches, the tops, and the trunks of the larger trees they'll cut up and haul down the hill to the sawmills for lumber, and everything else they chip and put the chips into big machines that shoot the chips into chip trucks, and they will haul those chips down to biomass plants, and they burn the trees for energy, for kilowatts. And in many cases, we're not just talking about seedlings or saplings. They're chipping entire forest understories, the entire lower and even the mid canopy of the forest. Trees up to, in many cases, they'll take everything up to 14 inches in diameter at breast height. Just to put that in perspective, in a lot of forests, that's a tree that's anywhere from 65 to 80 years old, a tree of that size. And so they're not old growth trees mostly, but they're not young either, and they're not small. And those trees, 14 inches in diameter and smaller, can oftentimes make up a pretty significant portion of the carbon in the forest, a third, 40%, sometimes more. And so that's all being cut and chipped for biomass. And then, of course, the branches and the tops of the larger trees, which is oftentimes a third or more of the biomass in the mature trees is being chipped and hauled away for biomass. In post-fire logging, they're clear-cutting entire stands of snag forest habitat, trees of any size, including giant snags, 5-6 feet in diameter, and chipping them and hauling them away for biomass. We call that clear cuts for kilowatts. It is a climate change disaster. It's a biodiversity disaster, and taxpayers are footing the bill for it on our public lands based on a series of lies told by agencies that are profiting from these practices, and logging companies that are also profiting, and frankly, by politicians, both Democrats and Republicans, who are getting campaign contributions from these industries. So this is one of the key things I try to get across to readers in my book, Smokescreen, is that you are being deceived. But the good news is that we can do something about it. And there's a lot of good news in this. Fires are not destroying our forests. They're actually restoring our forests. We don't have too much fire in our forests. We actually still have a deficit of fire relative to natural levels. We don't want too much. We don't want too little. Most people don't realize we still have too little. And logging is not restoring forests. It's not keeping carbon in our forests. It's not stopping fires. It's not promoting forest health. It's not protecting communities. And this is all good news, because it means once we see past and through the lies, we can put pressure on policymakers to change course. We don't have to spend tens of billions of dollars of taxpayer money on policies that are just making things worse. Instead, we can just save that money, or we can spend it on something that will actually make the world a better place. Spend it on healthcare, spend it on education, spend it on a jobs program to create fire-safe communities through defensible space and home hardening. But don't spend it on backcountry logging, which is just about the dumbest thing we can do in the 21st century when we need our carbon sinks to draw down that excess CO2 in the atmosphere.
What's the difference between a forest and a tree farm?
A tree farm has about as much in common with a parking lot as anything. It's much more. It has much more in common with a parking lot than it does with a natural forest. A tree farm is a place where the logging companies have come through, or if it's public land, Forest Service has sold an area of forest to the logging company, and they'll come through and they'll clear cut a complex, biodiverse, mature forest that has all those habitat elements I talked about earlier. They'll clear cut that, and then they'll come in and they'll spray a bunch of toxic carcinogenic herbicides like glyphosate to kill off all of the vegetation that they see as competing with the little nursery grown tree seedlings that they want to plant. And they'll come in and they'll plant those nursery grown seedlings, and all you have is just these little all these little planted trees and nothing else. No snags, no down logs, no mature trees, no wildflowers, no shrubs. And when that stuff starts to grow in again in places naturally, they'll come in and spray more herbicides and kill it off. And again, these herbicides are carcinogenic. They're toxic. They get in the water. The industry claims that they have a very short half-life, and so don't worry. None of that's true. The half-life is like 3 weeks. But again, oftentimes it rains before that 3-week period after the herbicides have been sprayed, and it washes right down into streams. And it goes down into the valleys where the farmland is, and it ends up in kids' breakfast cereal. And this is not the way to go. And again, we're subsidizing this with taxpayer dollars, which is not a smart thing to do at this point. It's not a good thing for communities. And by the way, there's so many human health impacts, not just all the general ones that we're becoming increasingly aware of from climate change, which is made worse by logging. Which, by the way, logging in the U.S. now is responsible for a level of annual carbon emissions that is almost equivalent to annual emissions from burning coal in this country. So that's what we're talking about. This is on a massive scale. We are one of the biggest global culprits in terms of annual carbon emissions from logging on the planet. We're actually worse than Brazil. And it's mind-blowing for most people to realize that, but we actually emit more carbon from logging each year than Brazil or from logging in Siberia. And so, we have a global responsibility to change course and to set a global example. But yeah, when these logging operations happen, the and especially when clear cutting happens, that's the industrial forestry model: is spray toxic herbicides, plant a tree plantation, and then anything that you didn't plant, if it grows in, hit it with herbicides again. And then of course, once that tree plantation, which is basically like a crop, it's not a forest ecosystem, it's just like a crop. Once it gets to a certain age, they log it again. That's the whole plan, because once they've created an artificial non-forest system that's just designed for timber production, they want to keep producing timber from that for as long as they can before it just won't produce anymore. Now, interestingly, and this is another bit of good news, there are places where they clear cut a mature old growth forest 70, 80 years ago, even 60 in places, and they planted a tree plantation. And then they just walked away from it, which is actually pretty common. They didn't maintain the tree plantation. They didn't do anything. They just figured, oh, we'll come back to it sometime and log it again. And for one reason or another, that didn't happen in that particular place. But it's interesting because you can see what nature does to that artificial area. Over time, nature forms it, shapes it back into a complex biodiverse system. Trees grow at different rates. Some die and then they fall, and you've got pockets where shrubs come in and young trees that they didn't plant come in, and wildflowers bloom, and now all of a sudden you've got a more diverse ecosystem that's starting to develop. So nature will rewild these areas all on its own if we just leave them alone.
Some people are concerned. I mean, there's a legitimate concern about invasive species, but I also think that sometimes the solution is worse than the problem. And it's a lot of times the solution is to use herbicides or whatever. Are there instances in which, is it generally better to leave the forest alone rather than go in and try to control invasive plant species with herbicides, or invasive insects with insecticides? How does that work? What's your experience on that?
Yeah, generally it's generally intervention makes things worse. There are exceptions to that. There are, invasive species is certainly a significant problem, but if invasive species are removed manually, not with herbicides, pulled up by the roots and removed, that can do significant good in localized spots. It's labor intensive, but whatever, it's important work. It creates a lot of jobs. Program. Yeah, you bet. It's jobs program. That's good ecological work, and it works. It's effective. On the other hand, herbicides tend to have the opposite result. Yes, you will kill plant life, and people think, okay, look, I killed a bunch of these plants, and therefore I did a good job. The problem is they grow back. You're not actually killing them. You've just killed the above ground portion. They grow back. What happens is when herbicides are applied, after successive cycles of herbicides, and people keep not getting the result they want, and then they figure, well, the answer is more herbicides. What happens is every single successive cycle of herbicide application shifts the balance further away from native plants and further toward the invasives. So the invasives become relatively more dominant with every application of herbicide. It is wildly counterproductive.
Why is that?
I don't know. And frankly, I don't know if anyone knows. It's a good question. I don't know why herbicides
it is easy to understand. It is easy to understand how they're in a farming context. I know herbicides can create super weeds. You have weeds that are resistant to the herbicide. Yeah. So there's that, but I'm not sure if that's what you're talking about.
No, I don't know. I don't know. And that might be a factor, but I suspect it's more complicated than that. And I don't know the answer to that. It's a good question. And I've read the research, and those answers, the researchers who have done some of the primary work on this and found that this is what's happening, they don't seem to understand why it's happening. Maybe somebody does, but if they do, I'm not aware of it. But it's a good question. But we do know that's what happens. That's what tends to happen. And so I'm a big fan of manual removal of herbicides. It's a labor-intensive way that creates a lot of jobs and actually works. and doesn't destroy a lot of things in the process, or God forbid, make herbicides even more dominant. Um, but that's the exception to the rule. Certainly, intervention with herbicides it's fraught with all kinds of problems. Not to mention the toxicity.
Is there evidence?
Yeah.
Let me ask you: is there evidence? No right or wrong answer. I just want to know your objective response. Is there evidence that, like, an herbicide like glyphosate can impact soil biology and or like food chains, underground and things like that? I don't know if that.
I'd be shocked if it didn't, but I'm not aware of
Yeah.
research on that. And it may just be that the research hasn't been done. It's also possible that some enterprising researchers have actually looked at that question. I haven't seen those studies. That's possible too. But I frankly would be shocked if it did not impact the microbiota in the soil, because these are obviously very, very sensitive ecosystems, very complex ecosystems. And microorganisms that are impacted by many, many different things. And there are natural disturbances that they're adapted to. They're adapted to fire. They'll shift in their composition in various ways if a fire comes through, but they're not destroyed by fire. They remain intact. Even in the highest intensity fire patches, the mycorrhizal fungi networks in the soil, they remain very intact and they thrive. But they have no evolutionary history with something like glyphosate. Mm-hmm. Right. So anything that has no evolutionary history, we know from science, it tends to be disruptive. It is rarely benign. Mm-hmm. It can be mildly disruptive. It can be profoundly disruptive. It just depends on the circumstance. Which one this is, I don't know in terms of the mycorrhizal fungi networks and the impact of something like glyphosate. But I wouldn't be surprised if someone's done some work on that. But if they have, I haven't seen it. It's a great question. I might look into it. One thing I should mention too, just to your question, is that oftentimes people aren't really thinking, like, how do the invasives get there in the first place? Mm-hmm. Well, the primary vector of these invasive weeds is typically logging machinery. There's tiny little seeds from these invasive grasses, for example. They get in the treads of the logging machinery. They get in the tires. They get in all kinds of things. They're tiny little things. They get stuck everywhere. And the logging industry and the Forest Service, they'll say, well, we try to hose things off and we try to reduce that. That's a joke. It doesn't work. Only a small percentage of that is ever going to be mitigated. Most of those seeds are still going to be there. And that logging machinery is rolling over the ground all over the forest. It's dispersing those seeds. And what you see after these logging operations, including what they euphemistically call thinning, is that a year or two later, you will oftentimes see a carpet of these invasive grasses, like cheatgrass, sometimes 2 feet tall and just thick, that's spread throughout the area that was logged. And right at the edge of the logging unit, it basically disappears in the unlogged areas. And so not only are you having an impact on native grasses and native forbs because of these invasives like cheatgrass, but they also are highly, highly combustible. And so they actually can increase spread and intensity of wildfires.
One other question that I can think of, and that is, the American West is rapidly desertifying. And I would think that, I don't know how much of that is historically forested areas and how much of it was historically grasslands, but is our current forest management contributing to desertification? And could your recommendations to protect more forests, could that help reverse desertification?
Absolutely. Yeah. In areas that have not been logged, or if they haven't been logged in a long time and they're recovering from logging 70, 80, 120 years ago, what you find, and this has been measured, but it's also palpable. You can walk into these areas and you feel it on your skin, that it's cooler. There's more moisture in the air. There's more ambient moisture, literally in the air. The temperature is lower. The wind speed is literally lower because the denser stands of trees act as a windbreak. And so all the desiccating effects in the environment are mitigated by that denser stand of forest. And so it maintains its moisture because it absorbs so much moisture, and it has ways of keeping that moisture in the system, in the live trees and the shrubs and the down logs and snags. And in the microclimate that is fostered and perpetuated by that denser forest condition. When logging happens, whether it's a clear cut or whether it's a so-called thinning operation, you are undermining that microclimate. You are not only removing much of the water from the system, because trees are comprised substantially of water, also a lot of carbon, but also a lot of water. You're removing a lot of that water from the system, but you're also undermining the microclimate that allows the water to stay in the system. And so logging actually contributes to an element of desertification, or something on the spectrum of desertification. And so protecting forests and shifting away from logging, reducing our wood consumption, shifting to non-wood alternatives, will actually reverse that and prevent a lot of that. Now, some of that, in places where drought cycles are being exacerbated by climate change, some of that is going to happen, regardless. But a lot of it can be mitigated very, very substantially by shifting away from logging and protecting forests.
Dr. Chad Hanson, this has been a wonderful, informative conversation. I recommend to our audience that you get Smokescreen. What's the subtitle? But I want to recommend that you get Smokescreen wherever books are sold.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you can get it on Amazon. You can get it on bookshop.com. You can get it through the publisher, which is University Press, Kentucky. The full title is Smokescreen: Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate.
Okay. Thank you very much for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me. It was nice. Appreciate the conversation.
My pleasure.
Take care.